out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it is going to be the turn of the indie band Daniel Takes a Train, who have a new album out January 2021. Indeed, great timing. It's titled Last Ticket to Tango. And now, for those who may or may not know the band, yes, they were around in the late 80s or mid 80s, as you'll hear in the interview. Anyway, they split, and then 30 years later, the German record label, Fire Station Records, run by UV, I do believe, and possibly someone else, decided to get in touch and put out a compilation of the band. So suddenly they got a new album 30 years later. That was the original material back in the day. But they've managed to keep it going and have released this album. So you'll hear lots more about that. So I won't spoil it all for you because, frankly, we're going to go through that in great detail because I spoke to the guitarist. In fact, it is Daniel Synge. So, after several minutes of casual chat, we got down to the exciting subject that was his early formative musical years. We are slightly the same age. Anyway, Daniel, tell us more. Tell us now.
We're obviously from the same generation, probably have similar musical references. And I didn't really get going in the band until I met Paul, who the singer sings. And he was really into pop music in a way that I wasn't. But we did bond over a love of the Smiths. Before that, I'd been in school punk bands and I'd played lots of sort of youth clubs and things like that, but hadn't really taken music very seriously. But with Paul, he had a very strong sense of melody, and I began to write tunes for him. And I guess that's what we're still doing now. Paul has a very pop, clear voice, and I like all sorts of things. Before we did this album, I was doing a film music course, and I was getting together a band with a sort of glamtronic feel. We had a mixing glam with electronica. I'm not sure anyone else is doing that, but so this is almost took us in a completely different direction. And it's a very poppy album, I think, and I think it's got, for people like you, it's got lots of references, possibly to things you might have listened to in the late 70s or early 80s.
Yeah.
And the things that I liked when I was at school, like new wave or glam rock or ska, and just sort of more energetic music. Because I think people who know about Daniel Takes a Train always assume we are 80s, which possibly means padded shoulders and synthesizers, but we weren't that. In the 80s, we were a very primitive band with sort of old guitars and old amps. We were not channeling Phil Collins or Rio. So, but we're trying to do that now. But sort of 30 years later, we've sort of discovered this.
Yes. Well, actually, when I was listening to the new album, there was two kind of musical kind of genres that came out. There was one, which was interesting, you mentioned ska, because it was kind of like, that had that two-tone quality to it. And also, the vocal was quite Martin Fry from ABC at times. It kind of reminded me of, yes, that kind of sound.
Well, you see, the track you might be talking about is called Last Ticket to Tango.
Yes.
And that literally came about not long ago. We had to finish the album. We didn't have what's called an album title song, like a working title for the album. But Paul just threw out this line, Last Ticket to Tango, which sounds very ABC in itself. And then he had this song that was literally a Martin Fry ripoff. I said, we can't do that. We really can't be as shameless as that. So I wrote something else, which had a similar feel. And that was the last track on the album. So I think Paul would be kind of happy to admit there is an ABC reference there, but we didn't have Trevor Horn with us to kind of
no
bring the orchestra in.
Oh, okay then, because it did, because after a while I kept thinking, as it was playing through, thinking, You know, it was, and I might be getting confused with a few of the other earlier songs, but there was that kind of two-tone rhythm that was kind of chugging along in the background in a slightly merry way, and thinking, oh yes, that's definitely, reminds me.
The first track on the album is called "Sleeping with the Enemy," and we wrote it because I just wanted to write a ska song. Because when we played live, we just ran through this music, and I thought, well, when you're standing on stage and people are dancing, you kind of start to work out what people like.
Yes.
And for some reason, they're going to like a tune that they could sort of jump up and down to. I don't think ska is a very complicated music to move to. It just gets everyone moving. So, and then we sort of came across this idea of doing a James Bond tribute, and then we threw in some Cold War references, and then it became a sort of if you like, early James Bond reference to, ska, Doctor No, and obviously with the pop beat, and there's even a rap in the middle, which I'm not responsible for, but it works.
Yeah. So when you were making this, obviously this was pre-COVID, wasn't it? So you didn't have that kind of experience of what was going to happen next.
I mean, we decided to do an album last year, but we only had 6 tracks. So we were recording this time last year, but it just so happened the studio time we booked happened to coincide with periods where studios were open, which was sort of a miracle. And we knocked them out pretty quickly. So we had, 2 days in one studio, 2 days in another. And we were surprised sometimes that the engineers were working. We found a studio near me, actually, in Southeast London, run by a guy who has, he literally 300 yards from our front door. And he produced people like Katrina and the Waves in the 80s. He actually produced their big hit called, I think it was Walking on Sunshine.
Oh my God, that was just everywhere, wasn't it?
Yeah, and so he's got this sort of, if you like, new wave indie cred. And he was brilliant, and he looked at our songs and he completely understood, got what we were doing. And I think the skill of a producer like that is to give it the pop edge. Otherwise, It becomes just a lot of music, And so we're quite fortunate, A, to have met him, and B, to have recorded it within the year.
Well, absolutely. And this is Pat Collier, who's kind of got quite a CV, hasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, he did a lot of sort of post-punk bands, but I think the big one is the Katrina and the Waves.
Yes, it's interesting because actually with a lot of producers, I've realised, and it's a little bit like the photographers. Some of the photographers, they have a 3 to 5 year narrative, don't they? Where they have a sound that captures a time. That when we were growing up, a lot of people would talk about Mickey Most. I'm sure he's still alive, but you didn't. You realise that actually Mickey Most disappeared quite quickly because there must have been a sound that came along in the 70s where he was just like, this isn't my scene, is it? And I'm not going to change. And it's like, well, tough luck. A bit like you mentioned Trevor Horn. I mean, Trevor Horn in the 80s was everywhere, wasn't he? Alongside Phil Collins, everywhere you went, oh no, it's Phil Collins, he's just in my face all the time.
It takes a while for people to rediscover them, doesn't it? Yeah, for example, I was too young to really sort of wear glam rock clothing and go to see David Bowie, but it didn't really grab me as much at the time. But it's something you can dip into later.
Yes. So were you, when you were growing up in, say, the 70s, were you obsessed with music? Had you picked up a guitar or keyboards, or were you sort of kind of studying music in a slightly teenage way?
Well, I was taking trumpet lessons at school, but got completely distracted by things like the Beatles, and I even cut out guitars out of old cardboard boxes and used to mime to the Beatles. This is long after they split up.
Yes.
And then I guess the whole punk thing enabled people like me to just to jump on board and form bands and not to worry about how terrible our playing was.
No, it was a green light, because I realized for me, indie pop was between the years of 83 to 87, which was the years of the Smiths, which were like the big band, weren't they? Because up to then you had the punk scene, then the post-punk scene with people like the Gang of Four and Peel, Wire, possibly the Nightingales, and Marky Smith and the Four were coming along. And then you had those few bands who were pretty influential, like Echo and the Bunnymen and Julian Cope. But I think it was when the Smiths appeared, it was like, it felt like this was something. I mean, yeah, this was a start of something quite major, and then suddenly this kind of wave of indie bands appeared.
I think that's the thing. I mean, Paul and I really sort of bonded over the Smiths thing. I think I remember playing This Charming Man down the phone to him, and he was, I don't know what he did. Like maybe he ran to the record shop and bought the single, but it was that sort of light bulb moment that we should be in a band as well. But in hindsight, I don't think it was easy to be like the Smiths, because actually their playing was, certainly the guitar playing was pretty competent, way above what I was doing. And I think a lot of singers copied his vocal mannerisms and tried to write vaguely pretentious lyrics very badly. So, I mean, I don't know what they spawned, but at least it got us going. And I think plus their Englishness, the fact that they represented, you can sing about your local supermarket, or you can sing about going to the library, which was very exciting.
Yes, absolutely. And during that period, I found it incredibly exciting, because then you had all those other bands like the June Brides and the Wolfhounds and Yeah, Yeah, No. It was certainly a wave. And then, the NME brought out that famous cassette, the C86 cassette, which had 22 tracks with people like The Wedding Present and Fuzzbox and Yes, Jesus and the Mary Chain. Or it might not have been that. It might have been Primal Scream. Yes, classic band. So when did the band form? When did you sort of call yourselves the name and went, that's it?
We had a couple of years where we were called a terrible name, Illicit Kiss. And I'm not quite. So at that time I was into things like Everything But the Girl and the Smiths and Lloyd Cole, and I just wanted to wear like suede jackets and
Right.
big guitars. And
Did you watch Betty Blue by any chance?
of course, yeah.
Excellent.
I didn't have the bath, the bath in the middle of the room.
I think that was Diva actually on that one, but
oh, sorry, yeah.
that's fine. Any French film, which I think that had that.
But there was so there was a moment where we were into that sort of guitar-y sound, and then I suppose as the band, then we became Daniel Takes a Train, and suddenly the shift was more sort of jazz, sophisticated pop. We're talking sort of 1987. And that's when, to me, it got a little bit boring. But I think all bands evolve, and I think you have to keep changing. And I think that's the great thing about doing an album now, is that you can do anything you like. So we do have a ska-ish track. We have a track that sounds like I don't know, just a rock and roll track, or a synth pop track like Song for the Brokenhearted. We've got a song called Honeymoon, which sounds like Motown. So, we're just throwing it all in there. And I think because we've lived a long time, we've soaked up a lot of influences. We have more to say, but we have more tricks up our sleeve than we did in 1985.
And probably, the technology's moved on. How long did the band in the 80s last for? When did you?
Yeah, we probably active between 84 as this other band called Illicit Kiss, and then probably a couple of years doing Daniel Takes a Train. And around 1988, I decided I'd had enough. It wasn't sort of going anywhere. I think we were trying to get a big record. In those days, you could get a big record deal with a big advance, and used to read about bands. I think there was a band called the Roaring Boys who famously got, £1 million advance, and we were after that sort of thing. But you can tell when your moment has gone. And the last gig we did was at the Lewisham Labour Club, attended by about, I don't know, half a dozen people. Whereas a few weeks before that, we played at Ronnie Scott's. So I decided I went to travel to Spain to work as an English teacher. And I think I was right. The others won't agree with me, but I think I was correct in this decision because shortly afterwards, the whole music scene changed and guitars were completely out. And it was, DJs and house music, Chicago house. And we if we carried on, we probably would have just soaked that up as well, and in a really bad way. I think I did the right thing.
Well, it's interesting because my theory, which isn't completely watertight, but I quite like it, was that 87, was the sort of year when the Smiths finished. They felt like the end of the party, and if you hung around, you were going to be stuck in the kitchen doing the washing up, and it was all a bit messy, really. And it definitely changed. And there was like the Smiths breaking up, then ecstasy came along, and there was suddenly people, and as you just mentioned, the Chicago house sound and acid house had happened, and people were sort of, with smiley faces taking lots of ecstasy, and there definitely was a musical movement. And what I've noticed is that the 16 to 18-year-old who's kind of got that moment where they can dedicate all day every day to music or whatever they are into, that generation wants their sound. They don't want a band that had been around 4 years. That they want their kind of band, don't they? If you think about when we were growing up, that period where you realise in the early 70s, the Beatles had only just broke up, but we had the Beatles for us were just kind of like, they were long gone, weren't they? But they'd only broken up a couple of years, and we'd already moved on to the kind of incredibly exciting sound of Gary Glitter and wanted to be.
The first album I bought was a music for pleasure album called Ride a White Swan, which is basically old T-Rex songs repackaged.
Nice.
And this was in about 1974 or something. But I mean, a couple of years later, Mark Bolan was finished. He was
75. He was already
on cool. And but I think the 80s is interesting because we did actually ride a couple of movements. I said we were in the indie pop area. We were in the what's now called sophisti-pop, which is sort of Sade, that kind of, it was a very London scene. I think these, Animal Nightlife, Sade, jazz. But not playing jazz, but sort of aspiring to jazz, if you like.
Well, it was always, you could always tell, wasn't it? Because it was the bass player, it depended what the bass player was holding, how he was holding his bass, made you realise he might have had a sort of a jazz pop fusion sound, and probably like Jaco Pastorius or somebody like that.
Well, we played a version of Moondance at the Ronnie Scott's club. We supported a band called the Jazz Defectors, I think. And I just think the gall of playing this song, really, it wasn't bad. It was just a bit like a pub band playing a Van Morrison cover. But we did it, and that's when you're young, you do that stuff like that, don't you? And luckily, there is no recording of that. But might be a cassette somewhere.
Yeah, I think that's where the band might have broken up, wasn't it? Musical differences covering Van Morrison.
But yes. I think the point is that we do have musical differences, but we're all working towards Daniel Tater Train sound.
Yes.
Today.
So when you had your Jim Morrison moment and you called it the end, kind of, did you all just kind of was everybody slightly in agreement? Did it feel like it was the end?
I think there was a school of thought that if you work hard enough at something and you do the gigs and you do demos, you'll get somewhere. But I don't agree with that, and I think they think that they would have got signed eventually. But for me, it's important to have a musical journey that is exciting, and it's exciting getting back with the band and making an album and making a very almost like contemporary sounding album in 2020 without having to make an album that's rooted in guitar pop or say indie bands from the 80s.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is great, but we've done that.
Yeah. Did you, because obviously everyone loves this story that, and a lot of bands, to be honest, a lot of bands I interview from that period, they have that 5-year narrative in the 80s. They get together, the honeymoon period, the first album, not too bad. If they get a John Peel play, even more exciting, which often gives them that bit of hope that you had in the 80s. The second album, things aren't going terribly well by then, unless you're, the Smiths or U2 or somebody like that. Mostly it's like things are starting to sort of go, and then by the second or third album, people have just had enough because they've got fed up with each other and no money. So that's always kind of it. So did you, when you sort of walked away, did you, I mean, with the band, you'd recorded all this stuff, but you never really put it out. Was it just something that you personally had thought, well, you know, that's in the attic and who cares, and get on with the rest of your life?
That's interesting. I mean, obviously someone did pick up on us eventually, which was great. But it was nearly 30 years later. And we did have enough material to fill an album called Style, Charm, and Commotion, which came out on Fire Station 2 years ago. And they're quite good demos, you know, but some of the songs are better than others. But it does mark a sort of full stop on that time.
Yes.
It feels strange to play those songs now because they're written from someone who could hardly play guitar and someone who didn't know much about life and was just imitating stuff he heard on the radio. Whereas I think today's songs are more us. But yeah, I think, you know, I don't know what I did later. I probably didn't play guitar for 20 years. And I think I went off and joined a jazz band and played piano. I did something completely different musically.
Yes.
And I think people do find their way back. And it was a great time, but I think, you know, anyone who's trying to be successful in music has to know how far they can take it before they should start up another project. Not all projects work, do they? You can't expect all. I mean, the thing about Daniel Takes a Train, it works because we know each other, but we also know our limitations and what we can and can't do. So we keep it within those parameters. So I'm never going to go off and do an electronic album with members of Daniel Takes a Train without vocals, because they wouldn't enjoy it. And I think with Daniel Takes a Train, you know that there's a chorus coming. There's probably a sax solo. It might be quite catchy at the beginning, but not all music's like that.
Yes, you're not going to make your Low album, are you?
Well, if I'd have to relocate to Berlin or somewhere like that. So unfortunately, I can't go anywhere right now. I could make an album in Forest Hill.
Yeah, I mean, did it? I know you're keen on the new album. You know, when you sort of realised the band, you got this interest 2 years ago with Fire Station Records, and then you started sort of looking at your, you know, like, did you still have your original guitar and various stuff in the cupboard? And you started thinking, my God, I've better buy some new strings and sort of remember how to play some of these songs.
That's a really good question, because I really struggled to play the songs we'd played 20 years before when we got back together. And as I said, you know, when you play guitar, you have to play every day, otherwise your fingers go soft and you can't hold the strings properly.
Yes.
And I've been sort of in bands playing mainly keyboards, and so yeah, it felt like you know, we had to have a few rehearsals. And the first gig was really nerve-wracking. We had to play at this venue called the Troubadour, and it was sold out. And the bass player had to come down from his house in Nottingham, and we only had one rehearsal. And I think it was a bit, you know, I think we were doing phone call rehearsals, which is not ideal. But it all worked. It really did work because we stuck to our guns. We thought, well, we won't do anything too pretentious. We'll just play the songs we know, the songs we think are the more outstanding ones.
Yes.
And luckily, it went down really well. It wasn't a time for virtuoso playing.
And did you, and no one mentioned the Van Morrison moment.
We didn't play Moondance.
Thank
either.
God.
When there was, you know, you do become quite critical about your back catalogue. I think there were some pretty awful songs we could have played that we luckily sort of passed.
Yes. Did you feel, because I remember coming across this, there's one of those series, it was BBC 4 on a Friday night, and they had about bands reforming, and obviously they're sort of very mixed experiences. And from bad to just terrible, and we should have never done it. And there's a couple of which haven't been too bad. But then when the police kind of reformed, everyone was having a great time apart from two of the three members. And, there was like a tour which was worth millions. So everyone thought, let's make it work, please. So they had band therapy. Did you, when you obviously you had your honeymoon period of sort of, this, fire station putting out the record and sleeve notes. And it must have been quite nice to archive all this and have it. But then meeting each other and thinking, oh, right, we're going to start playing music again and thinking of this new album, which is quite ambitious. Did you have to sort of have a few, like band therapy moments?
Well, I think we had almost like quite a say stressful time, but we had a very weird time shortly after reforming because a manager turned up who had been recommended by someone, and he had all these big ideas for us. And so, from thinking, oh, let's do a couple of gigs in London and get our friends down, he was suggesting we might get a record deal or we might go on tour. And he was coming up with these wild plans to go to, for example, he wanted us to go to Norway on breakfast TV because that's where bands broke in Scandinavia. And so and then, the most ridiculous thing was, we were going to be doing I think it was one of the major telecommunications companies were looking for a song to do their Christmas campaign. So our single was going to be their tune, and we were going to re-record it in Abbey Road. So you can imagine, we're all in our 50s, so we're a bit experienced, we're a bit, we're not stupid kids anymore. But, we're getting slightly swept along by this and thinking, well, some of us might want to leave our jobs soon. And so there was a lot of excitement, but all the excitement turned out to be completely misplaced. And that, I think, did create some difficulties with relationships in the band because, some were more trusting than others. And luckily, this manager's disappeared. I don't know where he is, but he did cause a lot of trouble. And the thing is, he couldn't even get us a gig. We did all the management ourselves. And he was like a hanger-on who lied to us. I don't want to talk about him all night, but it did sour the comeback, if you like. Yes. And then we came back and thought, well, after he disappeared, we came down with a bump, and then what do we do? Do we want to do this? And then I suppose on the plus side, we decided to write some new songs, and that really sort of got us to where we are now. We've managed to complete the album, write the new songs, and so there we've done something at last.
Yes, and obviously having the project to do the new album gave it the focus as well.
Yeah, I think with lockdown, you see, we sort of got back to gigging and done a few gigs, club gigs, and but we weren't able to sort of play early last year, and then we started doing these, probably a lot of bands you've talked to have done these lockdown videos where they, the vocalist was singing through a phone and then sending me the vocal, and I was putting it together in my home studio. And it's not a very satisfactory way of working, but it can be done. So we were doing these sort of side projects, but then we thought, well, let's finish the album, and then we can discuss where we're going with this.
Yeah.
So I think early last year we had, as I said, we had 4 or 5 tracks in the bag, which is not an album. I think you need at least 10 or 11 tracks to complete it. So, we were just lucky to go back to studio 2 or 3 times more. And I think I am so pleased with the results, especially with Pat Collier's work in Prefab Studios. He's given us a real commercial edge, which we thought we didn't have.
Yes, I know. Well, that's as we were saying, it sort of has those kind of echoes of sort of two-tone and also ABC. I mean, are you still on Fire Station Records?
No, Fire Station put out the album called Style, Charm and Commotion, which is our retrospective album where you'll find all our original 80s music.
Yes.
But they didn't. Obviously, we don't have enough material for another one, and they only put out retrospective albums anyway.
Right.
I think this album was mainly aimed at the Japanese market, who are very avid collectors of 80s indie pop.
Yes, Vinyl Japan. That was quite one of those labels, wasn't it? And you also, with this one, you also had contributions from various other people, including, is it Jem Kelly, who was in the Lotus Eaters?
Yeah, Jem was in a band called the Lotus Eaters, actually long before Daniel Takes the Train. They had I think it was a top 40 hit with a song called First Picture of You. And I think Jem was discovered a lot when this mad manager was at his worst. This is no disrespect to Jem, but I think the manager wanted us to sort of do collaborations with 80s people.
Right.
They tried to find Mark Harmon, can you believe? And someone from I was nothing to do with this, but someone from the Icicle Works was going to come and play guitar for us. But they found Jem, and he played on one of the tracks which we recorded at BBC Kent live. So yeah, that was a nice moment for us.
Yes, absolutely.
He was never seen again after that.
Yes, I know. It's amazing you haven't got Sinead O'Connor on vocals, actually.
Well, because the manager was trying to get a band ready for me and Jem at the same time with another singer. It was all very complicated, but he was basically lying to so many people, and no one knew what to believe. But
my God,
I think the Jem Kelly thing was quite nice and positive, and also Jem was lecturing at a university in Buckinghamshire, and they had a really nice studio, and he put us on to a student producer who did a couple of tracks on the album, which was great. So thank you, Jem, for the contact.
Yes, and there's also, I haven't come across these guys like Keith Jones, Steve Barnes, Luke Hannington, Sam Butcher. Are these all sort of other musicians who are part of the band or part of the recording process?
Yeah, I mean, the band is four or five people, but obviously, over the years we've had all sorts of people playing with us live. For example, some of them are friends of James, who's the drummer. Paul, the sax player, plays in a Steely Dan tribute band.
Nice.
Is it called Nearly Dan or something? There's so many. But Keith is their piano player, so he gave us a nice sort of bluesy piano sound on one of the tracks. And they're not big names, but I think they've all made their. I mean, interesting. We had backing vocalist who lives in Barcelona who basically sent her backing vocals in online. So in the COVID period where you couldn't get more than 6 people in the studio, we couldn't bring a backing singer in, so we had to get them to record it in their home and then use it in the studio. So that's quite interesting. You can now work with people from all over the world just by sending music to each other.
Yes, because I was talking to a guy who was in the band that was in the early 90s, Jellyfish, and he was he'd done, I think, either bass or guitar, and he'd played on Noel Gallagher's album, and he said, "Oh yes, I'm working on the new Sinead O'Connor album, and just sending tracks over to them, so they'll be getting them because I think he was in LA, so it's an 8-hour difference. So I mean, it just is the way that people seem to make a lot of music now. It's just like phone up at somebody who can do the bass line anywhere in the world and just say, could you just do this for me, and let's see how it goes. So that's quite good. I realized that Jem he was also in a band called the Wild Swans, wasn't he, as well?
Yeah,
from Liverpool. So
they sort of connect us to the Liverpool scene. And there's another band called Candy Opera.
Oh yes,
we're on Fire Station, and they would have gigged around the same time as the Lotus Eaters.
Yeah, because they had quite a story as well. So does that mean then that this is a label that you've created yourself for the album?
Oh, which label is that?
No, are you now on your own label putting
Oh,
this out?
yeah. We don't. Yeah, we put the album out under the Roseville Music label.
Right.
So it's our first release. Again, it's our first venture into sort of releasing our own music through Bandcamp, and so far it's going really well. We've sold quite a few CDs, a lot of downloads.
Yes.
And because we're all, I mean, I used to be a journalist, and Paul used to be a manager in a company, and we're all bringing skills that could possibly, sell the music to a wider audience. And like tomorrow, we've got an interview with a radio station in the USA. So it's really nice to share this music beyond our sort of friends and family confines,
Yes, absolutely. And in theory, if next year gets a little bit different and we can go out, have you got plans of doing some dates and tours then around the place?
I mean, ideally, we would be touring this now because, for example, down the road from us, there's an old ballroom called the Rivoli Ballroom.
Oh God, I went there once many years ago.
So that would be the perfect place to launch Last Ticket to Tango.
Yes.
And we'd have, velvet jackets on, and it might be a bit ABC, and it might be a bit sort of come dancing, and it'd be a great evening. So
it would be a very nice evening, I have to say. Yes, I went there on the sort of, the ballroom dance kind of expedition. So yes, it would be good. So theoretically, you might be on the road doing some dates.
I think because we've all got, a lot of commitments, we're generally not going to be a touring band, but we will definitely like to set up some special appearances.
Yeah.
I think that's what we've always done. We've always been quite choosy about where we play, and we're not likely to sort of be fifth on the bill to a band, go on stage at 6 o'clock in the evening. But depends. I mean, I think I hope whatever we do matches the studio versions of what we've done. And I think we're aware that to put on a good show takes a lot of work. Again, in answer to your question, I think we'll just have to wait and see, because even if we were booked in somewhere in May, I wouldn't guarantee that would go ahead.
No, it's quite optimistic, isn't it, really? Let's face it. But anyway, so I guess you're just going to see how this one goes before committing to any more kind of recordings.
I think the idea is, let's get it out there. Let's see if people like it. Let's see if people want Daniel Takes a Train to play more gigs or release more music. For me personally, it's just great to put a proper full stop to which is a great story of a band being discovered 30 years too late, getting back together, playing live gigs, writing some fantastic new music, and then recording it in a really great studio down the road. And that's it. That's as good as it gets for me.
So did you find, or have you found sort of original fans who have kind of come out of the woodwork, who found the first compilation that came out 2 years ago, as well as, sort of discovering the new album? Have you been slightly amazed with that kind of response?
I think when we were originally putting the album out in 2018, we had a kind of crazy response from what you might call mainstream media, and we were on things like ITV News, LBC, Phone It, that sort of thing. So they weren't music programs such as your own.
Yes.
They weren't interested in the music, but they were interested in the story. And that story has brought a lot of people to us.
Yeah.
Who were really quite curious more than anything else to see, if it was true and what did they actually sound like. Because they would not have heard of us in the 80s unless they were you know, going to certain clubs in London. But so it remains a good story. But I suppose now we've sort of told that story. So now we're trying to basically get people to hear the music.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there are some amazing people who have found us and support us, and they buy the CD, and you know, they retweet everything we've put out, and we see them at gigs. But there aren't enough of them. If there were sort of thousands of people like that, you know, it feels like a small club at the moment.
Yes.
You know, I would love the club to be a bigger one. It's an all-embracing club of, you know, but after all, the music is very, you know, it's quite eclectic. You know, it could draw in 80s fans as well as indie fans. It could draw in, I don't know, sort of classic rock fans even. So it's a broad church, and we'd love more people to discover us.
Yes. I mean, I was just thinking on a personal level, has it sort of given you a bit of a, I don't know, adrenaline shot in your life, this kind of new excitement? I mean, because obviously, you know, we trundle along and one day you think, you know, I'm now in my mid-50s, it's like a bit strange I got here. And you start thinking about life a bit. And then, you know, having kind of exciting things that have come along kind of are a relief in a way. You know, you just say, oh, thank God that's happened. Otherwise, it all becomes a little bit samey. And I suppose being in a band is the ability to not to sort of try and go down on your knees during a guitar solo because you might not get up again. But you know, just that kind of excitement of like, blimey, we're still playing music. I didn't see this happening when I was in my 30s and 40s.
Yeah, I mean, you know, especially this year where we have not been a lot going on, and the music gives you a real sense of purpose, especially, you know, something as finite as putting an album together. There's a lot of detail. You know, it's not just playing music, it's designing, it's you know, spelling the names of songs correctly, and you know, organizing design and print and marketing now, of course. It's like a little job in itself. But the music has really, personally, the music has kept me sane in this most terrible of years, and I think the rest of the band would probably agree with me. So yeah, we're all lucky to have the music muse among us.
Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine that. Yes, being able to focus on something creative rather than getting obsessed with social media or something would be quite depressing, really.
I mean, it seems strange that we've done music, but we're not actually playing it. You know, we're not rehearsing. We're not doing gigs. So it feels like we're in a bubble of some sort. Probably a bit like your show. You rely on feedback, don't you? And you really need feedback from people to reassure you that what you're doing is good.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, otherwise. But like, you know, I mean, just briefly, I mean, in the old days, you just had those kind of very set gatekeepers. You had the music papers, you had people like John Peel, and also other radio shows. But there was definitely, you know, it was good, but it was quite limited. Whereas now it's more diluted, but you can get out there and you can obviously have your music all over the world, can't you? You know, being sort of, you know, on any social media platforms, and you know, kids like it, and you're on Spotify and stuff like that. So I'd imagine it will sort of grow in that way.
Yeah, it probably won't grow, you know, quickly like a sort of top 10 single, but it would. I mean, I'm very happy for someone to discover this in 5 years' time. It'll still be there.
Yes, absolutely.
And therefore, you know, by then we'll be doing something completely different. But you know, let's face it, I mean, my daughter's discovering the Beatles now, so you know, albums have a longer shelf life, I think, than anything else. And
yes, this is true. So look, last question: if you could have said something to an 18-year-old, you know, what advice would you give? What advice or wisdom have you got over the decades? You know, if you could have said something to an 18-year-old self starting out, that you have that experience now, I just wondered what you would say to them.
I think I wouldn't say don't do music. I mean, I've done music since I was 16 as a hobby. I'm still doing it now. At 18, I wouldn't have dreamed I'd be doing this. in my 50s, but you still get the same excitement from it. I think the problem with Dan Synge in the 80s, which isn't the problem now, but I think we tried to create music that was professional sounding and slick, and whatever the music industry thought music should sound like, we tried to copy it.
Mm-hmm.
And I would advise my younger self not to do that. I would advise them to just do anything else like that. To do something that really reflects your personality, who you are, and where you're from. And I think we did a cassette in the 80s, and I brought it back, and went to my girlfriend's house, and I was really excited, and I put it on the cassette deck. I said, "What do you think of this?" And obviously my ears were ringing. It was a really exciting day. We did 3 tracks, and all she could say was, "It sounds really professional." But that's the worst thing you can say about music, isn't it? And because a robot can sound professional, so I just think go out there and do it, and
Yes.
don't even play guitar if you can't. I mean, there's so many ways of making music now. It's still a great time to create, find audiences, find like-minded souls such as yourself. It's lovely.
Well, I think it's kind of interesting you made that point, because I noticed some of the bands or some of the artists that I liked who had done things in the 70s and possibly even in the 60s, when they got to the 80s, instead of doing what they were good at, which was kind of creating their own sound, they seemed to go, "Oh, I might copy what's kind of popular at the moment." I'm thinking of David Bowie, really, but there was also people like Rod Stewart and Robert Plant. If you look at their solo work in the 80s, it's not that good. And I still think it was kind of, they got the producer that they needed. They went for this sound because that's what they were told. And they kind of went for that, rather than thinking, what do I want to do? It's like, oh, what's popular at the moment? This is a bit of a sweeping statement, but their work is pretty like, let's skip the 80s and get to something else that they did after that. And it's interesting that you, even though you were young and doing your first stuff, instead of like doing something like Jesus and the Mary Chain or something, which was kind of like, well, you're definitely not copying that many people. Well, okay, the Velvet Underground, I suppose, but there was like, it was quite radical, wasn't it? And rather than trying to sound slick and sort of smooth.
But I think the problem as a musician, see, a musician in the mid 80s would find it really hard to copy Robert Palmer or Rod Stewart or David Bowie, because it was all about production. So, we would rehearse in a basement with hardly any light. We'd have old amps, and the drums would be next to the guitar amp, and you just make a racket. And therefore, by the very nature of the equipment you're using, your playing was essentially guitar pop. It's like the Beatles in the Cavern, isn't it? And yet, David Bowie could have walked into any studio around the world and produced amazing music, regardless of the quality of the songs.
Yes.
And we didn't understand that. We didn't have the money to buy synthesizers or find good producers. I wish we'd known how, because we wouldn't have spent so long in a smoky basement. But I think also people in the 80s weren't necessarily trying to be in the 80s. I think we were very much, I personally was into the 60s and the 80s, and all my references were sort of decades earlier, and my guitars were 1960s guitars, and I probably had an old valve amp, and I liked 60s cars, you know what I mean? So I've really got to like what the really commercial 80s later, and that's informed me of how to make music today.
Right.
And I don't mind listening to Rod Stewart, Tonight I'm Yours. I think there's something there are merits to it.
Yes, I'm sure there are merit. Lady Jane, was it Lady Jane? His big single that he had, Baby Jane, that was it.
Yeah.
From the
likewise, I mean, at the time I would have, smashed the single to bits, but today, well, maybe we're more forgiving as we get older.
Yes, that's right.
Everything has merits. I'm
Oh,
very keen to see the good side of anything.
yes. Well, it was the decade that I sort of loved, but I suppose I was one of those kind of whingy, lefty, red wedge types who just loved all that indie pop and angst. So, bands like the Redskins and yeah, obviously, the Smiths were we loved to moan, didn't we, about everything. So, and that suited my personality.
Mrs. Thatcher. I mean, it was, yeah. When I watched there was an interesting documentary about Slough Council the other day, and it tapped on that very moment where, if you're a slightly lefty school kid, you would have loved some of the Slough Council's work, which is basically political but wrapped up in a sort of pop music.
Yes.
And it was the moment they met the politicians is when the band sort of started to think, well, maybe this isn't for us. So everything was a sort of flirtation, and everyone was sort of moving on quickly to something else.
Yes, well, yeah. I mean, the 80s was quite a tricky one, wasn't it, really? But yes, it was interesting. But
I don't have any particular memories of the 80s other than, like, I didn't even watch Live Aid. I wasn't interested in watching it, and I'm not even sure I was around in the 80s. But whatever I was doing it in my own little bubble, like a lot of people do. You create your own world, don't you? And I think that's what music does for you. You can, especially being in a band. If you've got a band, you're stronger. You have your bandmates and your songs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you're just probably just focused on that very immediate moment that you realize is very ephemeral, isn't it? It's not going to be about you, whether you know that at the time, especially when you're young, but you realize that it is going to be that next recording, that next single or next album and the next gig. And, no one really knows if it's going to last another year or another 3 years. But yes, it's quite interesting.
I'm surprised how some of the 80s bands continue to attract huge audiences. And I saw Tears for Fears in Hyde Park a few years ago, and I was just amazed that they could. I don't know what the capacity was, but everyone sung along to the songs. And I mean, someone said the other day to me, the 80s is as long ago as the end of the Second World War was to us in the 80s. So, the very fact that we're talking about the 80s is practically ancient history.
Yes,
which is why I'm not really keen to talk about it.
I know. Well, it's only 40 years ago, or the latter part is 30 years. So it is a very long time ago, and it is, like you said, when we were growing up, that would have been that would have been the war or the in between the wars. So it's a very long time, but I suppose we still pick over things, and it still has shaped us, and it's sort of obviously, you can't get. Sometimes you can escape from your past, but obviously in your case, someone from Germany with their record label said, "No, we're going to put out your album."
It's a sort of calling. I think that, and also before we were called by the German record label, I was actually getting back into music, and I'd watched a film called Sing Street. I don't know if you've seen it, and it's an Irish musical, and it's got songs by The Cure and I think Duran Duran and The Jam, and it's about a kid who's at school and he wants to start a band and become famous. But some of the songs on the album are not original songs, and they've been written to fit into the 80s narrative, but they're new songs. And I was quite inspired by that, the idea that you could write contemporary pop music with 80s tropes, if you like, and somehow create something new and original.
Yes.
So I was seduced by that idea, and I think that's very much what we're doing with this album. Is, you listen to the album and you don't go, oh, well, it's an 80s album, but you are in a sort of comfort zone of the 80s, without sort of going into The Wedding Present or it's pop music, but it's recognizable.
Yes, there's definitely influences from ABC to the beat. That would be fair enough, wouldn't it?
Well, I could go. I don't want to sort of take each track and go, that sounds like this, but we've got a song called "My Town," which is a great lyric about high street, the high street shops closing, and I think Paul wanted to write a political song, and that sounds like Tom Robinson Band meets Boomtown Rats, and that wasn't something I set out to do, but it's just got that kind of pop, ploddy, punk new wave sound, which we've never done before, and therefore it sounds really fresh.
Yes. So with a track like you've got Dreaming of a Better Day, is that one you did during lockdown?
Yeah, this is a song I wrote actually, and it was I don't actually write all the lyrics, but this one I did, and I wanted to throw a few ideas in that sort of summed up the mood we were in Brexit and all the sort of divisions in society, and then it's a weird song because if you wrote the lyrics out, you could probably identify various moments last year, and you could say it was prophetic, but it's just a mood really I'm picking up, and the US elections and Donald Trump without sort of naming names, and so and it's also our first attempt at doing a rock ballad, like an 80s power ballad. We wanted the strings, we wanted the sort of heavy guitar coming in at the end, and all that. So that's a bit of a departure for us. And if you'd listened to our sort of jangly pop from the 80s, you'd be quite surprised we'd done this. But maybe this is a sort of the future for us, sort of rock ballads. Who knows?
Yes. And what about Don't Let Me Go?
That is a track that is originally on our first album, which we have rewritten and taken out the jangle, and again turned it into more of a kind of new wave pop song. It's quite nice to sort of play around with your own material and see if you can bring it up to date.
Oh, there you go. So yes, My Town is about your high street. And then just lastly, Stranger Things Can Happen. Was that in lockdown?
That was one of the first songs we wrote after we reformed, and I think Paul had been meeting lots of these ex-rock stars who were going to collaborate us with this manager I told you about.
Yes.
So I think he got this idea of this kind of Norma Desmond type character who was big in the 80s and probably sitting in some coke-fueled mansion somewhere, dreaming of his when he had a hit and was going to get a band back together a bit like us. So it's a little bit like, it's about us, but maybe someone who's a little bit more deluded. So,
yes, it's quite weird. Your story has been quite fascinating, actually, hasn't it?
If that's an interesting story that could relate directly to us, and it is a strange thing to be discovered, and although we're not known throughout the world, it is interesting to be an entity again.
Indeed, it would be nice to be discovered one day. Anyway, look, that is the end of the interview. A massive thank you to Daniel Synge from Daniel Takes a Train. This has been David Eastaugh, the C86 Show. If you want to contact me, you can. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, just do C86 Show. Thank you ever so much. Also, all these interviews have been podcast or archived, and you can find those on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. Check them out. They might just change your life. They probably won't. Anyway, have a great week and stay safe.